All right, on the phone, live from Chicago, from a march that's taking place, I think, right now. Jeff Smith. Jeff, welcome to the program.
How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing great. So where are you now?
We are moving from Union Park in Chicago down to the Boeing headquarters. This is a protest against the Boeing Corporation and their participation, in the war machine. And then, although Boeing's already decided to close for today, so the concept of shutting it down has pretty much been accomplished. There's also going to be an additional action happening at the Obama headquarters. And so...
You there?
Forgive the trains passing overhead. That's the Chicago's famous L. And so the protest of this is not just about NATO and specifically war, but also the president and, the government's policies associated with it. And as usual, there's no partisan message here. This is very much against everything that our government is doing right now on the war front.
And my understanding is yesterday there were thousands of protesters marching with Iraq and Afghanistan war vets, ending with attempts by some of these vets to return their service medals to NATO generals.
Yes, yesterday's ceremony was definitely one of the most moving things I think I've ever seen. To see vets in particular get up and talk about things like what they've personally done to the Afghani people and how they feel about committing atrocities and making, children motherless was so powerful. And particularly when you realize that people that get into the military very often do it because they think it's right. And so it's not that they don't come in thinking that what they're doing is going to be productive, and then to see that transformation, to see them realize, what they're doing is not really what they were sold and what they're told they were doing. And so that transformation is really powerful.
So just give me a sense of what you've been doing, starting with Friday.
So on Friday we went to Rahm Emanuel's house, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can.
It's a little loud. Okay, great.
You're good.
So we're at Rahm Emanuel's house, and it was targeted specifically around the healthcare cuts that have happened in this city, and they've closed down mental health clinics all over the city. And, it's really a response to the austerity in the face of spending millions of dollars on this summit coming to Chicago. And so there was protests there, and then following that, on Saturday, as I said, there was this huge march, on Sunday rather, there was this huge march in support of the veterans. But what happened really after the ceremony with the vets was one of the, again, sort of most terrifying instances of police repression and brutality. In New York City, you see the numbers of cops are incredible and overwhelming and intimidating. But in Chicago, the real distinction was the gear and the outfits. And it really brought home this idea that we are militarizing our own country. And the police and, the so-called defense of our citizens in this country really feels like an occupation at this point. So you saw guys in stormtrooper outfits and, body armor that really looked like they were headed to disarm a bomb in Iraq or Afghanistan. And so the idea that they would come out and display that kind of force and then not use it, it's almost like, what else do you expect to happen when you bring people and suit them up and put them in contact with people trying to protest? And so people were really savagely beaten, and they weren't really afraid to have that shown, I think. I mean, if you see some of the photos out there, it was really aggressive and violent. And so, the march and the protest continued on yesterday from the late afternoon on into the wee hours of the night where people were still marching and people got arrested and brutalized all day long. So, it was really a powerful day, but then what it turned into was more of a symbol of the repression of what happens when you speak truth to power. That anti-war message is so powerful that I think the only way that they can try and keep that message from getting out is to just intimidate people and make them afraid to speak up. And you see that with whistleblowers and people within the institutions, but also just for the general public to have the courage to come out and support those people. This is a clear message of how they're trying to respond to that.
Yeah, I encourage people to take a look at some of the photos. I think we have some up on the blog at majority.fm of what the cops were wearing. I mean, full on body armor and just bizarre in a way. I mean, just to see these guys walking around there, they almost look like not almost. I mean, they look like Imperial stormtroopers, except for they're in black, I guess, as opposed to the white. So how many people? I mean, I imagine it's very difficult to get a sense of how many people have come in to the city to protest. But what's your sense?
It was definitely in the tens of thousands. I mean, the highest reports I've seen were, maybe 60 or 70,000. But I would say certainly no less than 20 or 30,000 people here. And once again, I think this is the biggest sort of protest of this nature in quite a long time. And you can clearly see the boost that Occupy has given to a movement. So you saw, the sort of old line anti-war protests that you normally see in the groups that have been doing this for a long time. And then a massive influx of, young people and very creative people with their banners and handmade signs as opposed to pre-printed materials. And the confluence is really powerful. And I think that what we're looking at is just the continued evolution of the protest movement in this country. Occupy Wall Street is really more about a series of tactics at this point, and we're still obviously looking for what the next great tactic is going to be, but to continue to try and make attempts to put people out in the street and really not give up pushing the boundaries of protest is I think what's going on here. And it really feels like there's continued momentum coming ever since the spring and the weather started getting warmer. I think this is a big difference between what you saw in January in Washington, D.C. versus, now here in Chicago. This is a far more impressive national showing.
And what have people been meeting and starting to plan the next events? Has there been anything like that going on there?
I haven't seen as much of that. It hasn't been terribly organized other than just, individual groups putting things together, working autonomously, at least as I've seen. But certainly the people have shown up here, and that's the first and most important step is to actually get people to show up. I don't really know exactly what the next plans are. I know in New York, certainly people are planning for the summer, and you're going to continue to see a progression of the movement in New York. But I think this is definitely, from what I've talked to people in Chicago, this is a huge boost of energy to them. This is as big of actions as they've ever seen. And, even today on this Boeing march, this is, multiple times bigger than I think they would have had in previous attempts. So, I would say now we're walking with, between 500 and 1,000 people, I would say. And I'm sure it will continue to grow as most of these things do throughout the day. I think we're going to be set up outside of Boeing and then outside of Obama's office all day. And so, it's a disorganized movement in some ways, but that's really the power of it, and it's really hard to disrupt, and I think it just continues to move forward in that way.
Have you heard anything about the crackdown on the live streamers, the Tim Pool and the others who were in this car? Why they were targeted, or if they were targeted?
I have. that was certainly one disturbing incident, and really more disturbing was the incident around the so-called NATO3. And what you had there, at least some people are talking about, is that you had agent provocateurs that came in and planned with people, and they created incendiary devices, and then they charged them with terrorism. And it's so reminiscent of, in this city, Chicago, 1968, where, it's a clear ploy to use an agent provocateur and trump up charges and scare people and do these sorts of things preemptively. It very much seems like Rahm Emanuel's goal around this thing was to use those sort of targeted, intimidating, preemptive raids in the middle of the night. And, what happened to Tim Pool and the other Livestreamers was they were essentially stopped and frisked, in their car. So they were, the car was blocked. They came out with their guns drawn and told them to get out of the car, and they searched them and, emptied their pockets and looked at all their hard drives and, basically let them go because they didn't have anything on them that they could arrest them for. But certainly a tactic that is designed to intimidate and scare people. And ironically, I think the people from New York are less likely to be scared because they've been through this.
Right.
But what happened to the ones charged with terrorism? I mean, they're being held on $1.5 million bail each. And, once you open that up, I mean, it was literally the first time that this anti-terrorism statute has been used in the state of Illinois since they passed the law here, just after September 11th. So when they start to inject terrorism into the subject, around the police actions, that really tells you that the gloves are starting to come off with this movement.
What is there anything else you can tell us about those three? Do you know any of them? Do you know anybody who knows any of them?
No, I mean, the background on them is that I think two of them were from Florida. They were definitely from out of state, and they've been traveling around. I see it as certainly that it was just a situation where these guys were kind of patsies. And sadly, because some people are sort of naive or open to suggestion, they were able to be coerced into doing things that I think most dedicated activists wouldn't do. And so, we talked internally. Certainly, if we were ever at a meeting and someone brought up the idea of making Molotov cocktails, every Occupy activist I know would, probably turn that person into the cops or certainly distance themselves from it. And so, it reminds me of in New York City when Bloomberg was sending in provocateurs into the mosques, in Muslim communities and trying to incite terrorism. And you actually found that a lot of the Muslim community members were turning the cops in, telling them, I think these guys are terrorists. So, when they did it to these guys, I think they just found their patsies or someone that were very young and impressionable in a way that allowed them to go along with that really stupid plan. And I'm hoping that it doesn't cost them for a very long time.
Has there been much black bloc tactics used there that you've witnessed? Any?
For sure. I mean, in the march with the bets yesterday, there was quite a large contingency of people that were dressed in black bloc attire. And although they weren't terribly aggressive, they were certainly prominent. And I think that the police saw them as a way to visually, at least, create a scenario where they looked like the enemy. And, it's gotten to the point now where, sadly, I think that for some, particularly young people, there's sort of it's almost a fashion statement. There's a certain sort of coolness and chic to dressing in that way and to, showing your resistance in that way. But to most of America, I think it's a really easy way to paint the protesters as being the other and to being something that's kind of scary. So, I'm definitely torn in some ways behind it, but really what I saw was just people dressed in, black clothing, and, they're basically on the same march as everyone else, certainly supporting exactly the same causes. So it's just merely a thing of optics, I think. But they were definitely as visible, I think even more so than in New York, people that were dressed in those costumes and were looking to not necessarily do anything violent. There was really no smashing of any kind. I mean, even the police, I think, only accused some people of throwing, empty plastic water bottles at them. So I really didn't see any instances of smashing windows or vandalism. But, when people are brave enough to actually lock arms and try and, not let a police line push them around or try and hold their ground, that's when you started to see the violence happen. And
right.
So, it wasn't about crowd control and it wasn't about keeping the public safe. It was about creating a confrontation and then when the time was right, exercising extreme violence. And, it's a pattern we see over and over again. And, I'm hoping we can figure out a way to move past that because it's really the best, PR defense, I think, that the status quo has right now is to turn this into an armed conflict so that they can be the good guys and we can be the bad guys. And when you see Army vets on stage talking about, how they're sorry and how they got into this for good reasons, but now, they're ashamed of their medals and ashamed of everything that they've done, it's so powerful. I mean, you just can't, it's really hard to dismiss that. So instead, they've opted for trying to paint us as something else. And so I think that's going to continue, and it's really, I guess, the onus is back on the protest movement now to figure out a way to move beyond that because the militarization of the police forces that we're coming up against just seems to be escalating. And, it's really kind of a scary time in this country. I mean, people used to talk about after the Patriot Act that, it's a slippery slope to becoming a police state. And you're really starting to see how far that has progressed, in the decade plus since it's happened.
Do you have a sense of how Chicago residents are taking all this?
I think most Chicagoans have tried to largely stay clear of the area because they were told ahead of time that everything was going to be shut down and to stay away. And, it's ironic because the reason why Rahm claimed that NATO was coming here was because it was going to be a huge economic boost to the city. And instead, all we see is basically a deserted city with protesters and huge numbers of cops. But when we were in Rahm Emanuel's neighborhood, there were plenty of his neighbors sitting out on their porch, enjoying the people, talking to us. And it's not that they, hate the mayor or there's not huge negative feelings against him, but certainly they did not have any issue with the protesters and certainly felt like the police response was, pretty ridiculous. But it seems to me very much similar to what you find in New York, that there's a section of the populace that's just going to support, the status quo and the powers, and it's really hard to move those people off. But, I talked to a woman on the march yesterday, and, she was 51 years old, an African-American woman, and she said it was her very first march ever. She's from Chicago.
Wow.
And she said, she finally, and I asked her specifically about the Occupy movement. She said, when I saw those kids out in the street, it made me think, I'm not scared to do that. And, had been harassed at her job, and she had issues with, the corporation that fired her. But I think a lot of people are disgruntled, but don't really know how to actually put that dissent into action. And so giving them a model, making them realize that, you can actually show up not just on election day, but any day, I think that's starting to spread. And, I think what we'll see is that hopefully there'll be another sort of inflection point where a particular action and something will happen, and you'll see, a doubling or, an exponential leap in the type of people that are involved in this sort of activism, the same way you saw last fall. So, it's encouraging, but I don't want to make it seem like it's necessarily going to be a continuous climb. I think it's a long fight, and that eventually, you may start to see things start to change in a really fast way, but only after a particular type of scenario happens again, and I don't know that we can predict when that's going to happen.
All right. Well, Jeff Smith in Chicago, thanks for the report. Stay safe. And stay out of jail. I'm glad you weren't in the clink when we called.
Yeah, no. I think that for most of the part, people that didn't want to get arrested, I think have been able to stay away. And overall, the Chicago Police Department has been way friendlier, even still, despite those outfits, than the New York Police Department ever is. And so it really feels like they picked out certain people and they said, I can beat up this guy, but I don't want to beat up this person. And that's why I think a lot of the images you see are overwhelmingly, young people or people that they think that they can make sure are acceptable to persecute in this kind of way. And so, it definitely resonates with the idea that certain people in our society are targeted and, live in a sort of justice system that's different than everyone else's. And I think that's also one of the really powerful things about this movement is that it allows people like me and people that enjoy a lot of privilege to really feel that in a way that's visceral and that changes you, and I think that's the same kind of transformation that you saw the veterans have, is that when you have to hold the rifle and stand out there in a war zone, it changes you in a fundamental way. And I think that that's really important, and ultimately that's the real change that Occupy Wall Street is having on this country, is that when you actively participate in this way, it changes you the way no message or TV commercial or politician's speech can, I think.